Now, I think that David could have written this psalm in many different places in his life. But I think it's best that it fits in the context of Absalom's rebellion. And I think it was during that rebellion of Absalom, that's why we read over there in 2 Samuel 15. I think it was during that revolt that his own son rose up against him, is when David wrote this psalm. But I want to read this psalm to you. He said, "Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For thou hast been a shelter for me, and a strong tower from the enemy." And I think the enemy literally would have been in verse 3. I think that would have been Absalom. That's my opinion. I could be wrong, but you never know. I could be right. "I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will trust in the covert of thy wings, Selah. For thou, O God, hast heard my vows. Thou hast given me the heritage of those that fear thy name. Thou wilt prolong the king's life in his years as many generations. He shall abide before God forever. O prepare mercy and truth, which may preserve him. So will I sing praise unto the name forever, unto thy name forever, that I may daily perform my vows." I think that's just an absolutely terrific psalm, and I think it fits best when Absalom rose up in the revolt. Now he prayed about that foe I mentioned in verse 3. Absalom was one of David's foes. He prayed in verse 6 for protection for his life. He said, "Thou wilt prolong the king's life, and his years as many generations." And he prayed for the security of his throne in verse number 7, where it said, about he shall abide. The word abide there really seems to be a reference to the throne of David. So the psalm opens in verse number 1 with David crying out. Flip back a couple pages to Psalm 57. This was, I mentioned, one of my other favorite psalms as well. He said, "Be merciful unto me, O God, be merciful unto me. My soul trusteth in thee, yea, in the shadow of thy wings will I make my refuge." And look, I have this highlighted in my Bible. "Until these calamities be overpassed." Now, David was in one in Psalm 61, and so he says here in verse 2, kind of what he said in Psalm 61, "I will cry unto God Most High, unto God that performeth all things for me. He shall send from heaven, and save me from the reproach of him that would swallow me up, Selah. God shall send forth his mercy and his truth." A lot of that is repeated very similarly anyway in the 61st Psalm. Now, David's crying. He's crying out in distress in verse 1 of Psalm 61, but when the psalm closes in verse 8 with David singing praises unto the Lord. So there's a season in our life, you might be in a calamity and you might feel overwhelmed and you cry out to God, but at the end of it all, I hope you're still praising God and singing praises unto the Lord. But as far as the entire story of Absalom's revolt against David, it started in 2 Samuel 15 where we read, and it ended in chapter 18 with Absalom's death. And you know, David wasn't happy that Absalom died. He said, "Oh, would to God that I had died for him." I mean, he wasn't happy with that. But I feel like as Christians in America, we could be approaching a real crisis. I mean, a real crisis. If the wrong people with the wrong policies get voted in, and I have to be honest, as a Christian believer, it is such a no-brainer which way to vote this election. It doesn't even, I can't imagine, you're going to put this on the internet? Okay. So, then I have to be a little bit careful. Jack Scalise gave me a video the other day from Matt Stover from Liberty Counsel. You might want to watch this, Pastor. This tells you what you can say and what you can't say, but I haven't watched it yet either. Anyway, good. But if the wrong people win with the wrong policies, because we can talk about policies, you know, I think America could face a worse crisis than we're in right now.
That's right.
I think it's so no-brainer. I said that. One side is pro-Israel, one side is not. That's almost enough for me. One side is pro-choice or pro-murder, whatever you want to call it, and the other side is anti-abortion. Now, I don't really need to go any further than that, if you don't want to, but I could go further than that. But I think it's a no-brainer. I think one side is so immoral, it's disgusting. And I think the other side isn't as immoral, but they could use some help as well. Because government can't save America anyway, only God can save America. However, the one candidate, Brother Mark showed me a video, and he said if he's elected in, he will ban the Muslim ban immediately and will even put more Muslims as part of his cabinet. Now, did you know they're not all friends of America? They're not all friends of Christians. And there's certain, it's like, okay. So enough said about that, but I'm just saying, we could be approaching as believers a crisis. By the way, I will say this, that is not the only election. There are several seats that are up for grabs in both the House and in the Senate, which if they go in the wrong direction as well, wow, that could really be bad. And we could be, now I'm not saying we're going to be in a crisis, I'll have to be honest. I look at it and say, it's just a no-brainer. How could anybody not vote the right way? But evidently there are people that are going to vote the wrong way. To me, I don't see how. I just look at it and I say, don't you remember how things were 3 years ago and 2 years ago and 1 year ago? Don't you remember anything? But you never know, right? So he says in verses 1 through 4, hear me, a cry to the Lord, that's what it is. And his heart is overwhelmed. The word overwhelmed is even used there in verse number 2. His heart's overwhelmed. Now this is the third week I've mentioned some of this stuff because I don't know who's going to be president in January or not. But there was an urgency to his cry. And I think we're at the point now where there needs to be an urgency to the cry as we cry unto the Lord, because we could become overwhelmed as believers. That's already shown its ugly head in the last few months as it is. So this was an urgent cry, because he was overwhelmed by what was happening and fainting under the pressure. Let's look at another psalm. Let's look at Psalm 142. So when I read these psalms, I find great comfort, I find great hope, I find great strength, and I just believe God's going to take care of us and we're going to trust him no matter what. Verse 5, Psalm 142. I cried unto thee, O Lord, I said, thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. Attend unto my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise thy name. The righteous shall compass me about, for thou shalt deal bountifully with me. Now, David wasn't literally at the end of the earth, but he felt that way. Now, I don't feel that way right now. I don't know if you feel that way right now or not. I don't know if you're in some kind of major crisis in your life or not. But he was away from home. He was away from the sanctuary of God. And he's speaking about spiritual geography and his need to know the presence of God and what was going on. Now, I'm going to mention this. What is going on? You say, well, we don't know for sure. Does America fall before the tribulation? Do all nations rise up against Israel? I mean, that's what it says. By the way, God is working 2 programs, and Israel is one of them, and God's not done with Israel. But anyway, so if all nations rise up against Israel, will we be one of those nations that rises up against Israel? So if that's true, and the wrong people win, it's just part of God's timing. Because the Bible does say the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. Could be. Will the Marxists, that's what they are, will the Marxists be allowed to take over our country? I don't know. They hate Israel, I can tell you that. And by what I'm watching on TV, and reading on, I don't watch TV, but what I read on the news, they don't seem like they don't seem like they love Israel at all. And so it's kind of concerning. So he uses this, look back at Psalm 61 now, verse 2. He uses this imagery. In verse 2, he says, from the end of the earth will I cry unto thee when my heart is overwhelmed. Here it is. Here's the imagery. He says, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. That word rock is used quite a bit. Let's look at a couple other Psalms. Go to Psalm 62, I think. Be the closest one to here, verse 2. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved. We shouldn't be moved. Jesus is the rock of our salvation. Verse 6. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. In God is my salvation and my glory. The rock of my strength and my refuge is in God. We trust in Jehovah God. That's who we trust in. Now I want you to go to Psalm 118. As soon as I get out of Psalm 119, I'll be there. So it says in verse 2, Let Israel thou say that his mercy endureth forever. Then, I want you to look at verse 31. There isn't a verse 31. I got the wrong verse. All right, never mind. Listen, here's what David needed. He needed God to sustain him. You know, all we need to sustain us is the power of God. That's all we need. We are never so far away that we cannot pray to God, or as in this case, even in the case of Jonah, you will never be so low that you can't pray unto God, right? He needed God to sustain him. Now get this. Go back to Psalm 61. David looked back at his life, and he was encouraged to remember that God had never failed him in any crisis. He says, For thou hast been, past tense, a shelter for me in a strong tower from the enemy. So David looked back and said, you know what? God's never let me down before, and I don't think God's going to let me down now. And I think that's the right attitude, and I think that's the attitude that we need to take and that we need to have. And God would not fail David. He's not going to fail us. So to David, God's home was the tabernacle, the place where the glory of God dwelt. And David longed to be back in Jerusalem to worship and adore the Lord. That's what he said in verse 4. I will abide in thy tabernacle forever. I will trust in the covert of thy wings. He longed to be there. Those wings are kind of like a mother hen, as she gathers their chicks around and broods over them with her wings. Probably referred to the cherubim literally on the mercy seat that covered the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. But you understand the imagery, and Jesus even mentioned it in the New Testament. Now listen, David was not a priest. So David could never enter the Holy of Holies. But he could abide in the Lord, just like you could abide in the Lord. And he could find his refuge in the Lord. A couple more Psalms. Let's see, go backwards to Psalm 46, I guess. See if I got this one right. Verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. That's who he is. And then if you bump on ahead to Psalm 90. Verse 1 there. Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations. We just have to rest in the Lord. Now, God's wings provided safety right where David was. Forever was the word he used in verse number 4. Has the idea all of my life. He says, hear me. It's a cry to the Lord. Then he says, you have heard me. In verse 5 through 8. And that is confidence in the Lord. So let me ask you a question before I read that again. Do you have absolute confidence in God that God can take care of you? That he can be your refuge, that he can be your strength, that he can be your high tower, that he can meet all of your needs? I mean, I'm talking about just resting in God. Every once in a while, I try to help people. I try to help people all the time. But every once in a while, I try to help people that just struggle with faith. I mean, just a strong faith. Just trust God. And there's some people, they just struggle with that. No, I hope that's not you here tonight. You don't need to worry. You don't need to fret. You don't need to get all bent out of shape over things that's going on. just trust the Lord. And you just have to trust Him. So David, first he cries out to God, but now he's got confidence in God, and that's just what you and I need to have in crisis. Confidence in God that God's going to take care of us, and we're not going to fret, we're not going to worry. And listen, it's all going to pan out in the end anyway, right, Amy? Because we all believe in the pan theory, so God's going to take care of it anyway. And He is. When David became king, he made some promises to the Lord and to the people, and David had intended to keep them. I trust that you do the same. He said that at the end of that psalm. But all through wilderness exile from Saul, David obeyed the Lord. He sought to be a shepherd to the nation. Why would the Lord care for David all of those years that he had? Give him his throne, and then allow him to be replaced with some wicked son. His throne was his heritage from the Lord. And just as the land of Israel was the heritage possession of God's people, and eventually it will all be theirs. So he gives a couple of requests in verse 6 and 7. He says, "Thou wilt prolong the king's life, and his years as many generations. He shall abide before God forever. O prepare mercy and truth, which may preserve him." What will preserve us is mercy and truth. They relate to God's gracious covenant that God made, it literally here with David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, I think. Now the Lord promised David a throne forever. He promised him a dynasty forever, which was been fulfilled in Jesus in Luke chapter 1. But David's concern was not for his own name or his own family, but for the future of Israel and God's great plan for redemption. And I think that's how we have to look at it. What is God doing? What is going on? What is God's trying to accomplish right now? That's what we're more concerned with than anything else. So his own throne was in jeopardy at the time, but David had confidence that God would keep his promises, and he must have had, and you and I must have that same kind of confidence. That's what I'm trying to tell you tonight. Just trust the Lord. May David live out his life, protected by God's mercy and truth. But for you and I today, it means simply this. We say our God reigns. But listen, Jesus reigns today. The throne of glory is secure, for God has set his king on his holy hill of Zion. So in view of the Psalms, let's follow David's example and just trust the Lord. Call on him. Obey him. Let me read verse 8 again. "So will I sing praise unto thy name," just worship him forever. And then he says that I may daily perform my vows. Just do what you're supposed to do every day and just trust God. That's all. And so he's overwhelmed, but he knew he had a rock to go to, and that's just where we need to go to. We need to go to the rock that is higher than I. So he's our shelter, and he's just like a shelter, just like that chicken would put her chicks under her wings. He's our strong tower. He protects us from our enemy, and all we do is trust him. He gave David an inheritance, and I want to remind you that God has an inheritance for us. Paul said we are heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. You say, well, I'm in no hurry to get mine right now. Well, that's fine, but he has one for you when you're ready. He has prepared mercy and truth for us. So we sing praises and we worship him daily and we obey him no matter what and no matter how everything turns out. I trust your heart is going to be set on just following the Lord, trusting God, living your life in the, how's it say in John 15? Abiding in him, living your life completely under the control of God, trusting him that he's going to take care of you. And we'll see what happens, and we'll just keep serving the Lord anyway, right? Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for these precious psalms that we read. I suppose probably everybody here has been in a crisis sometime in their life where they had to have something from the Word of God that got them through it. And for me, it was that 61st Psalm, Psalm 57, and then there's been a few other ones at other occasions in my life. But Lord, they're sweet and they're precious, and they give us confidence in you just like David had. And I pray if anybody's confidence is wavering, that you would strengthen their faith, strengthen that confidence, so that they might be all that they can be for your glory as we worship you and as we praise you and as we daily obey whatever it is that you would have for us to do on that specific day. And we'll thank you in Jesus' name, amen.